When I walked into the boardroom of Pinnacle Solutions as their new majority shareholder, my ex-husband Thomas nearly choked on his coffee. The man who had abandoned our family for his executive assistant 5 years ago was now just another employee, awaiting my decisions. His face turned ashen when I announced the company-wide restructuring would begin immediately, starting with the finance department, his department. The nameplate in front of me read, Rebecca Anderson, majority shareholder, the same last name he had tried to erase from his prestigious social circles when he walked out on me and our teenage daughter. Now, as I settled into the leather chair at the head of the conference table, I savored the quiet reckoning unfolding before me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The man who once told me I was too emotional to understand corporate finance was now watching me control the fate of his career. The boardroom of Pinnacle Solutions headquarters felt oddly familiar, though I'd never set foot in it before today. Perhaps because Thomas had described it countless times during our marriage. The Italian marble table he claimed was the center of his universe. The panoramic windows overlooking the Westlake City skyline he was so proud to command. Back then, he'd made it abundantly clear this world would never be mine to inhabit. Let me introduce myself properly, I began, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions beneath my professional veneer. For those who haven't met me yet, I'm Rebecca Anderson. Following the successful acquisition of Pinnacle Solutions by Summit Strategy Group, I'll be overseeing the transition and integration of our companies. I could feel Thomas's eyes boring into me from his seat halfway down the table. 5 years had passed since that sunny June afternoon when our daughter Olivia had graduated high school with honors. 5 years since I'd arrived at the ceremony, to find Thomas sitting with Jessica, his executive assistant, their hands intertwined in a way that made their relationship unmistakable. 5 years since he'd looked at my devastated expression and whispered that he deserved to be happy after 20 years of marriage. As many of you know, Pinnacle Solutions faces significant challenges, I continued, pulling up the first slide of my presentation. Your market position in financial technology has stagnated. Your client retention rates have dropped by 23% in the last 2 years. And your corporate culture, I paused, allowing my gaze to meet Thomas's directly, has developed concerning patterns that require immediate attention. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. As chief financial officer, he'd been responsible for the very divisions I was now critiquing, the same divisions that, according to my extensive research over the past year, he'd been deliberately mismanaging to justify budget increases that primarily benefited his own projects and compensation package. Before we dive into the specifics of my restructuring plan, I'd like to share my vision for Pinnacle's future under Summit's guidance, I said, clicking to the next slide. I believe in transparent leadership, data-driven decision-making, and creating an environment where innovation thrives regardless of office politics or personal relationships. A quiet murmur of approval rippled through the room. Thomas's management style was notoriously protective of his inner circle while publicly criticizing anyone who challenged him. His face had grown increasingly pale as I spoke, no doubt connecting the dots between my vision and his approaching downfall. Mrs. Anderson, Gregory Phillips, the CEO and Thomas's closest ally, interjected, "Your background in marketing strategy is certainly impressive, but I'm curious about your specific experience in financial technology. This is a highly specialized industry." I smiled, having anticipated this question from the man who had consistently backed Thomas's career advancement despite mediocre results. "A fair question, Mr. Phillips. After building Summit Strategy Group from the ground up, I've spent the last 3 years consulting for several fintech companies, including 3 of Pinnacle's direct competitors. My team's market penetration strategies resulted in a 46% growth for Rapid Pay and a complete digital transformation for Heritage Financial that doubled their valuation." I didn't add that I'd built my business while raising Olivia alone, or that I'd worked primarily from home during her final years of high school so I could be present for her after Thomas's abandonment. Those details weren't relevant to my qualifications, though they spoke volumes about my determination. What about your connection to Thomas Anderson? Jennifer Martinez, the Human Resources Director, asked directly. I believe you two were previously married. The room went silent. Thomas visibly stiffened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his pen. Yes, Mr. Anderson and I have a past relationship, I replied calmly. However, Summit Strategy Group acquired Pinnacle Solutions based solely on business merits and future growth potential. I assure you all that personal history will not influence my business decisions. A small lie. Personal history had indeed influenced one decision, my relentless pursuit of acquiring Pinnacle Solutions when several other investment opportunities had been available. But my plans extended far beyond settling old scores with Thomas. Now, let's move on to the first phase of our restructuring, I said, clicking to a detailed organizational chart. As you can see, several departments will be consolidated to eliminate redundancies. The finance division will be divided into two segments, strategic planning and operations. Thomas's face darkened as he saw his empire being split in half. For years, he'd kept the strategic planning division understaffed while focusing resources on routine operations that provided less value but greater visibility for his leadership. By separating them, I was shining a spotlight on his deliberate stagnation of the company's future potential. These changes take effect immediately, I continued. Melissa Chen will head strategic planning, while operations will temporarily report directly to me until we find suitable leadership. Thomas's head snapped up. Temporarily. I'm the CFO. These divisions have been under my management for 7 years. I met his gaze steadily. And during those 7 years, Pinnacle's strategic financial planning has fallen 32% behind industry standards, while your competitors have doubled their market share. The board feels a fresh perspective is needed. What I didn't say was that I'd spent months reviewing every financial decision Thomas had made, identifying patterns of self-serving choices at the company's expense. The board hadn't needed much convincing once they saw the data. Greg Phillips shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This seems rather drastic for your first day, Mrs. Anderson. Perhaps a transition period would be more appropriate. I smiled politely. The financial technology market waits for no one, Mr. Phillips. Every day we delay is a day our competitors move further ahead. Now, shall we continue with the presentation, or would you prefer to register a formal objection with the new board? The challenge hung in the air. Greg's objection revealed more than he intended. He and Thomas had clearly expected to manage me, to slow walk any changes I proposed. They'd underestimated me just as Thomas had 5 years ago when he walked out, assuming I'd crumble without him. No objection, Greg muttered after a moment's hesitation. Please continue. I nodded and moved to the next slide, outlining my plans for expanding Pinnacle's digital product portfolio. As I spoke, I noticed several of the younger executives leaning forward, engaged and excited by the vision I was presenting. They'd likely had similar ideas shot down by Thomas and Greg over the years. One final announcement before we adjourn, I said as the presentation concluded. I've reviewed the pending promotions list and noticed some concerning patterns. Effective immediately, all promotions and advancement will be reviewed by a committee rather than individual department heads to ensure decisions are based on merit rather than personal relationships. Thomas's jaw clenched visibly. Jessica, who had somehow risen to director of executive operations despite her limited qualifications, sat at the far end of the table, her expression a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. This new policy would effectively end Thomas's practice of rewarding loyalty over competence. That concludes our initial overview, I said, closing my laptop. You'll all receive detailed documentation of these changes by end of day. Department heads, please schedule individual meetings with my assistant to discuss implementation specifics. Thank you for your attention. As the executives filed out, murmuring among themselves, Thomas remained seated, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. When the last person had left, he closed the boardroom door and turned to face me. "What the hell is this, Rebecca?" he demanded, his voice low but intense. "Some elaborate revenge scheme? You destroy our marriage, and now you're coming after my career?" I laughed, the sound sharp and incredulous. "I destroyed our marriage? That's an interesting revision of history, Thomas. I seem to recall you were the one who brought your mistress to our daughter's graduation." "That was 5 years ago," he dismissed with a wave of his hand. "This is about now. You deliberately targeted Pinnacle for acquisition to undermine me." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I gathered my materials calmly, refusing to be baited into an emotional response. The acquisition was a sound business decision, Thomas. Pinnacle has solid fundamentals but poor leadership. My appointment is about saving a potentially valuable company, not settling personal scores. "You expect me to believe that's a coincidence?" he scoffed. "Out of all the financial tech companies in the country, you just happen to end up acquiring mine?" "Yours?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "This is a publicly traded company, Thomas, not your personal fiefdom. And yes, when Mark Wilson reached out to me after the board began exploring acquisition options, I was intrigued by the opportunity. The fact that you work here was a complication, not a motivation." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "You won't get away with this. The board might be temporarily impressed with your fancy presentations and marketing jargon, but they'll see through you eventually. You're out of your depth here, Rebecca. You always were." I smiled, remembering how he'd said almost those exact words the night after Olivia's graduation when I'd confronted him about Jessica. "You're out of your depth trying to run a household without me, Rebecca. You always were. Some women aren't cut out for independence." "We'll see," I replied simply. "Results speak louder than threats, Thomas. And unlike you, I intend to deliver actual results, not just inflated projections designed to boost my bonus." His eyes narrowed. "You think you know everything about this company based on some spreadsheets and quarterly reports. I've built relationships here for a decade. People are loyal to me." "Are they loyal to you or afraid of you?" I countered. "There's a difference. But we'll find out soon enough, won't we?" I moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Thomas, I've arranged for your office to be relocated to the East Wing. As a department head rather than CFO, you'll be closer to your team. Your new office will be ready by tomorrow morning." His face contorted with fury. "You can't demote me without cause. I'll go to the board." "The restructuring eliminated your position," I replied smoothly. "You weren't demoted. Your role was redefined. All perfectly standard procedure during a corporate reorganization. The paperwork has already been approved by the board. This isn't over," he growled as I opened the door. I turned back one last time. "You're right about that, Thomas. It's just beginning." As I walked through the executive floor toward what was now my office, I felt the weight of curious stares. Word had spread quickly about the new majority shareholder and her connection to Thomas Anderson. By tomorrow, everyone would know our history, or at least Thomas's version of it. But they would soon learn who I really was through my actions, not office gossip. The truth would emerge not in words, but in results, in the way Pinnacle Solutions would transform under my leadership. Thomas had always underestimated me, from the moment we met in college to the day he walked out, certain I would fail without him. My assistant Alex was waiting when I reached my office. "Your daughter called," he said. "Olivia wanted you to know she aced her law school exam. She said to tell you, Phase 1 complete." A smile spread across my face, a genuine one this time, not the calculated professional expression I'd maintained throughout the board meeting. "Thank you, Alex. Please send flowers to her apartment and let her know I'll take her to Harbor View for celebration dinner tonight." "Of course," Alex nodded. "Also, the files you requested on the finance division's last 3 years of decision-making are on your desk, and Mr. Wilson called to see how your first day is going." "Tell Mark the transition is proceeding exactly as planned," I replied, settling behind my desk. As Alex left, I turned to the floor-to-ceiling windows Thomas had so often bragged about in our marriage. The view was indeed impressive. Westlake City sprawled below, buildings catching the afternoon light, the river winding through the urban landscape. But unlike Thomas, I didn't see it as a symbol of power or status. I saw possibilities, connections, futures to be built for this company that had been stagnating under his leadership. I placed a framed photo on my desk, Olivia at her law school orientation, her smile bright with determination, her eyes reflecting the same resilience I'd relied on during those dark days after Thomas left. Everything I'd accomplished in the tie. Last 5 years had been for her, to show her that betrayal wasn't the end of our story, but the beginning of something stronger. Opening my laptop, I began reviewing the financial files, highlighting patterns that confirmed what I'd already suspected. Thomas had been systematically undermining innovative initiatives while promoting his allies and sidelining anyone who challenged him. The evidence was clear once you knew what to look for. My phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. "Did you really become the boss of Dad's company? Jason in my study group says his mom works there and everyone's talking about it." I smiled at her directness. "Yes, sweetheart. Summit acquired Pinnacle, and I'm overseeing the transition. We'll talk more at dinner tonight." Putting my phone down, I turned back to the files. This wasn't about revenge, despite what Thomas thought. It was about transformation, of Pinnacle Solutions, of the industry's approach to financial technology, of the corporate culture that allowed men like Thomas to profit, while damaging both the company and their clients' financial futures. And if Thomas was finally forced to face the consequences of his actions along the way, that was simply justice, not revenge. The day stretched ahead, filled with meetings and decisions that would shape Pinnacle's future. Thomas had once told me I'd never succeed without him. Now he would watch as I succeeded despite him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. That evening, as promised, I took Olivia for celebration dinner at Harbor View, the upscale restaurant, overlooking Westlake Marina. At 23, my daughter was already showing signs of the woman she would become, fiercely intelligent, unafraid to ask difficult questions, and possessing a quiet strength that sometimes broke my heart. She had Thomas's eyes, but thankfully, little else of him. "So you're really Dad's boss now?" she asked, cutting into her filet mignon with precise movements. She had always been methodical, even in small things. "I'm the majority shareholder of the whole company," I clarified. "Your dad is one of many people who work there." Olivia considered this, her brow furrowing in that way that reminded me of myself. "Is that why he was so upset when he called Aunt Jennifer today?" I paused, my wine glass halfway to my mouth. "Your dad called Jennifer?" Jennifer Martinez was the HR director at Pinnacle, but she was also my former college roommate. After my divorce, she had maintained a professional relationship with Thomas out of necessity, but I hadn't known they communicated outside of work. Olivia nodded, dabbing her mouth with her napkin. "I heard her talking on the phone when she dropped off those law review books I borrowed. She told him you were being fair and that he was being paranoid." The unexpected connection sent my mind racing. Jennifer had never mentioned keeping such direct contact with Thomas. As Pinnacle's HR director, she'd been instrumental in providing me with insight into the company culture during my acquisition research. Had she been feeding Thomas information all along? Was she a potential ally or a hidden threat? "Well, people see things differently sometimes," I said carefully, refocusing on my daughter. What matters is doing what's right for the company. Like how you made me study for the LSAT even though I wanted to spend that summer with my friends, Olivia asked, her question containing more wisdom than she realized. I smiled. Exactly like that. Sometimes what's best isn't what's easiest. Later that night, after dropping Olivia at her apartment near the law school campus, I sat in my home office reviewing more Pinnacle files. My townhouse was modest by CEO standards, a 3-bedroom in a good school district that I'd purchased after founding Summit Strategy Group. I could afford something larger now, but stability had always been my priority after Thomas left. I'd promised myself Olivia would never again feel the ground shift beneath her feet. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Congratulations on the acquisition. Coffee tomorrow? There's something you should know. Eleanor Wright. I frowned. Eleanor Wright had been Pinnacle's chief innovation officer before retiring last year after 25 years with the company. Her mentorship had been invaluable to many women in the industry, myself included, though we'd lost touch after I focused on building Summit. Something in the wording of her message suggested this wasn't a social call. Name the time and place, I responded. 20 minutes later, I found myself staring at a financial report that didn't make sense. Pinnacle's research and development funding appeared to have been diverted multiple times over the past year. Not eliminated, but redirected through a maze of internal transfers that effectively rendered promising projects stillborn, while maintaining the appearance of support on paper. The pattern was too sophisticated to be Thomas's work alone. He excelled at office politics, not creative accounting. This would have required cooperation from someone in the technology division, which meant Greg Phillips was more deeply involved than I'd initially suspected. I leaned back in my chair, the implications becoming clear. What I'd walked into wasn't simply a case of Thomas's mismanagement or self-serving decisions. There was something systemic happening at Pinnacle, something that might explain why the board had been so eager to accept Summit's acquisition offer. My phone buzzed again. Jennifer, we need to talk about Thomas. Coffee before work tomorrow? The coincidence of both Eleanor and Jennifer reaching out on my first day couldn't be ignored. I typed a response. 7 a.m., Copperleaf Cafe. Her reply came immediately. See you there. Sleep eluded me that night as my mind raced through possibilities. I'd acquired Pinnacle believing it was primarily a professional opportunity, a chance to expand Summit's footprint in the financial technology sector. The fact that Thomas worked there had seemed like an ironic footnote, a personal hurdle to overcome. But now I wondered if I'd misunderstood the situation entirely. What if Thomas's position at Pinnacle wasn't incidental to my acquisition opportunity, but central to it? What if the board had approached Summit specifically because of our history, not despite it? The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I arrived at Copperleaf Cafe 20 minutes early. I chose a corner table with a view of both entrances, a habit I'd developed during the contentious divorce proceedings when Thomas's lawyers had attempted to catch me off guard multiple times. Jennifer arrived precisely at 7, immaculately dressed, in a charcoal suit that contrasted with her vibrant auburn hair. Our friendship had weathered Thomas's betrayal and the divorce, though our busy careers meant we saw each other less often than either of us would like. Still, I'd never doubted her loyalty until Olivia's comment yesterday. You look like you. Haven't slept, she said by way of greeting, sliding into the seat across from me. Hazard of the new job, I replied, studying her expression. You wanted to talk about Thomas? Jennifer sighed, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. I should have told you he called me yesterday. He was livid about the restructuring, said you were using your position to settle an old score. And what did you tell him? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. That if he'd actually read any of the reports from the last 2 years, he'd know the restructuring was inevitable, regardless of who took over the company. She met my gaze directly. The fintech division has been systematically undermined for years, Rebecca, not just by Thomas, but by a whole cadre of executives with investments in competing traditional banking solutions. I blinked, taken aback by her frankness. "You knew about this?" "I suspected," she corrected. "HR sees patterns in promotions, demotions, transfers. When talented people in fintech kept getting sidelined while mediocre yes-men in traditional banking operations got fast-tracked, I started keeping notes. But I didn't have access to the financial data to prove anything." Relief washed over me. "So you weren't feeding Thomas information?" Confusion crossed her face. "What? God, no. Why would you think that?" "Olivia overheard your call with him yesterday. It sounded like you two were still in regular contact." Jennifer's expression shifted to understanding. "That was the first time he's called me in years, Rebecca. He was fishing for information about your acquisition, wanted to know if I'd had advance warning, if there was a way to contest it." I shut him down. I nodded, some of my tension easing. "I found something last night, evidence that R&D funds have been diverted. It's too sophisticated to be Thomas's work alone." "Greg Phillips," Jennifer said immediately. "He and Thomas have been thick as thieves for years. Greg's brother-in-law runs Heritage Banking Systems." The pieces were falling into place. "So, they've been deliberately sabotaging Pinnacle's fintech initiatives to protect outside investments in traditional banking?" Jennifer nodded grimly. "That would be my guess. But you'd need solid proof before taking it to the board." "Which is why Eleanor Wright wants to meet with me this morning," I said, the realization dawning. She must have suspected something, too. "Eleanor was always smarter than she let on," Jennifer agreed. "But, Rebecca, if this is true, you need to be careful. These people have millions at stake. They won't just accept your authority and step aside." "I never expected them to," I replied, thinking of Thomas's thinly veiled threat in the boardroom. But I didn't realize I was walking into a corporate conspiracy rather than just an awkward reunion with my ex-husband. Jennifer leaned forward, her expression serious. "Is that going to change your approach now that you know what you're really dealing with?" I considered this. The professional challenge was far greater than I'd anticipated, the personal element more complex. What I'd thought would be a straightforward corporate turnaround with the added satisfaction of proving Thomas wrong was revealing itself to be something darker and more dangerous. "No," I said finally, "it just means I need to be more strategic about how I dismantle their operation. Instead of a simple restructuring, we're looking at a potential criminal investigation." Jennifer's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and frowned. "Thomas has called an emergency meeting of the finance team for 8:30. He's not wasting any time trying to consolidate his position." "Let him," I said, a plan already forming. "The more desperate he gets, the more mistakes he'll make." As we left the cafe, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective in the early morning light. I felt a strange calm settling over me. The same determination that had carried me through the darkest days after Thomas's betrayal. Back then, I'd channeled my pain into building a new life for Olivia and myself. Now, I would channel it into saving Pinnacle Solutions from the corruption that Thomas and his allies had sown. "I didn't acquire this company for revenge," I told Jennifer as we parted on the sidewalk. "But I won't pretend there isn't a certain poetic justice in being the one to expose what Thomas has been doing." "Just be careful," she warned again. "Thomas knows all your buttons, how to make you angry, how to make you doubt yourself. Don't let him use your history against you." I nodded, though privately, I wondered if Thomas knew me at all anymore. The woman he'd abandoned, emotional, insecure, desperately trying to balance motherhood with career ambitions, no longer existed. In her place stood someone he'd never truly seen, a woman who had transformed pain into purpose, who had built her career not despite being a single mother, but drawing strength from it. Thomas had always underestimated me. Now that mistake would cost him everything he valued, his position, his reputation, and the corrupt system he'd helped create at Pinnacle Solutions. As I entered the gleaming headquarters building, employees nodded respectfully, unaware of the storm brewing beneath Pinnacle's polished surface. My second day as majority shareholder was about to begin, and with it, the real battle for the company's future. I arrived at Pinnacle headquarters 30 minutes before my scheduled meeting with Eleanor Wright. The morning sun glinted off the steel and glass tower, illuminating the company logo, a stylized peak with lines flowing through it, meant to symbolize the pinnacle of financial solutions. The irony wasn't lost on me. The company that had once promised to revolutionize financial technology had been secretly sabotaging its own future. My new executive assistant, Alex Porter, waited for me at the elevator with a tablet in hand and determination in his eyes. I'd specifically requested him for this role after reviewing personnel files and discovering Thomas had twice blocked his promotion despite stellar performance reviews. "Good morning, Ms. Anderson," he said, falling into step beside me as we headed toward my office. "I've gathered the files you requested on the R&D funding history, and Ms. Wright is already waiting in your office." "Thank you, Alex," I replied, setting a brisk pace. After my meeting with Eleanor, I'll need to see the operational assessment for Mr. Anderson's department from the last 3 quarters. The raw data, not the summarized reports. "Already on your desk," he said with the hint of a smile. "And I've taken the liberty of highlighting the discrepancies between the raw numbers and what was presented to the board." I glanced at him with newfound appreciation. "You've been tracking these issues yourself?" "Let's just say some of us have been waiting a long time for someone to notice what's been happening," he replied carefully. The office that now belonged to me still bore traces of its previous occupant. The weathered leather furniture, the old-fashioned globe bar in the corner, the collection of industry awards lining one wall. But I'd made one significant change. Where the previous CEO had displayed photographs of himself with politicians and industry leaders, I'd placed a single picture of Olivia on her first day of law school, her smile radiating confidence despite the difficult circumstances of our life. Eleanor rose from the visitor's chair as I entered, her imposing presence somewhat diminished by age, but her shrewd eyes as sharp as ever. At 68, she still commanded respect throughout the industry, making her endorsement crucial to my acceptance by Pinnacle's old guard. "Rebecca," she greeted me, extending her hand. "Congratulations again on your acquisition. I hear you made quite an impression yesterday." "Thank you, Eleanor," I replied, shaking her hand firmly before settling behind my desk. "But I suspect you didn't come here for small talk." She chuckled, resuming her seat. "Direct as always. It's why I've always believed in you." Her expression grew serious. "I assume you've started to notice certain irregularities in our financial reporting, particularly regarding the R&D division." I confirmed. "Funds allocated, but never actually deployed. Promising projects mysteriously stalled. Talent reassigned or pushed out, and all of it concealed through creative accounting." Eleanor nodded grimly. "I began noticing patterns about 2 years ago, subtle at first, then increasingly brazen. But by the time I had enough evidence to take to the board, I discovered something even more troubling." She leaned forward. 3 board members have financial ties to competing traditional banking companies. The revelation didn't surprise me as much as it should have. "Is that why you retired rather than confronting the issue directly?" "Partially," she admitted. "But mostly because I realized Pinnacle needed someone completely outside the existing power structure. Someone with the skills to turn the company around and the personal motivation to expose what's been happening regardless of the consequences." I raised an eyebrow. "Personal motivation?" Eleanor's weathered face broke into a knowing smile. "Don't misunderstand me, Rebecca. Your qualifications are impeccable. But when I saw Summit Strategy Group on the short list of potential acquirers, I recognized an opportunity. Thomas Anderson has been the linchpin in this corruption. Who better to dismantle his operation than the woman he underestimated so severely? The realization hit me with surprising force. You knew about our history? Financial tech is a small world, she replied with a shrug. People talk, especially about a rising star like yourself who managed to build a successful consulting firm while raising a child alone after her husband left her for his assistant. She studied my expression. Does it bother you that I considered your personal history in my recommendation to the board? I thought about this carefully. It would if that were the only reason, but it's not, is it? Not even close, Eleanor confirmed. I've been watching your career for years. Your work at Summit was revolutionary, and your strategic vision saved at least 3 companies from bankruptcy. You were the most qualified candidate by a significant margin. Your history with Thomas was simply fortuitous. I couldn't help but smile at her choice of words. There had been nothing fortuitous about the pain of Thomas's betrayal, the struggle of single motherhood, or the years of rebuilding my life from the ground up. But there was undeniable poetry in finding myself here now, positioned to hold him accountable for both his personal and professional betrayals. I need to know, Eleanor, I said, leaning forward. How deep does this go? Who can I trust? She slid a flash drive across the desk. Everything I've gathered is here. Financial records, email correspondence, meeting notes. It's not enough for legal action yet, but it's a starting point. She paused. As for who you can trust, Jennifer Martinez in HR has been quietly documenting the personnel side of things, and there's a young developer in R&D, Zachary Turner, who's been fighting to keep his blockchain project alive despite constant obstruction. I pocketed the flash drive. And the board? Divided, Eleanor said. 3 are compromised, 4 are oblivious, and 2, Richard Blackwood and Amelia Morrison, suspected enough to support Summit's acquisition despite significant pushback. Our conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Alex entered, his expression tense. Sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation developing. Mr. Anderson has called an emergency finance team meeting and is telling the team that the restructuring has been temporarily paused pending board review. My jaw tightened. Not even 24 hours, and Thomas was already attempting to undermine my authority. It was exactly the kind of manipulative power play he'd specialized in during our marriage, creating confusion about decisions we'd made together, rewriting history to suit his narrative. Where is this meeting happening? I asked, rising from my chair. Conference room C, East Wing, Alex replied. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Planning to crash the party? I'm the majority shareholder, I replied, gathering my tablet. It's not crashing if it's my company. Eleanor's expression showed a mixture of approval and concern. Just remember, Thomas knows how to provoke you. He'll try to make you look emotional, unstable. I smiled grimly, remembering how Thomas had weaponized my emotions against me during arguments, dismissing valid concerns as overreactions. Not anymore. That Rebecca is gone. The walk to conference room C gave me time to compose my strategy. This confrontation would set the tone for everything that followed. I needed to be authoritative without seeming vindictive, firm without appearing personnel. The sweet satisfaction of exposing Thomas would come through results, not emotional outbursts. I could hear Thomas's voice through the door before I opened it. Confident, persuasive, with that familiar undertone of condescension he always used, when explaining why his way was the only sensible approach. Simply a matter of timing, he was saying. The board agrees that such dramatic changes require more thorough analysis. Ms. Anderson is new to our industry and doesn't fully understand. I pushed the door open, stepping into the sudden silence with measured confidence. 20 faces turned toward me, expressions ranging from surprise to discomfort to, in a few cases, poorly concealed satisfaction at Thomas's ambush being interrupted. Please don't let me interrupt, I said pleasantly, moving to the empty chair at the head of the table. the chair that should have been left vacant in the majority shareholder's absence. "I'm always eager to hear Mr. Anderson's perspective on board decisions." Thomas's face flushed, though he quickly recovered. "Rebecca, we were just discussing implementation timelines for the restructuring." "How interesting," I replied, setting my tablet on the table. "Especially since I've just come from updating the board on the accelerated timeline. They're quite enthusiastic about the changes." It wasn't entirely true. I hadn't spoken with the board this morning, but neither was Thomas's claim of the restructuring being paused. I glanced around the table, noting who looked uncomfortable with my arrival and who seemed relieved. Since we're all here, this is an excellent opportunity to clarify the new reporting structure and priorities. Without waiting for permission, I connected my tablet to the room's display system. The organizational chart I'd presented yesterday appeared on the screen, with one significant addition: a detailed timeline for implementation with today's date highlighted. "As you can see," I continued smoothly, "these changes are not pending review. They are in effect as of yesterday's acquisition closing. I believe you'll find your new office is ready, Mr. Anderson. Alex can show you where it's located after our meeting." The struggle played out visibly on Thomas's face, the impulse to challenge me publicly warring with the realization that doing so would only undermine his position further. It was the same expression he'd worn the day I'd refused to sign over full ownership of our house during divorce negotiations, when he'd realized his usual intimidation tactics wouldn't work anymore. "Of course," he finally managed, his smile tight. "I must have misunderstood the timeline." "An understandable confusion during periods of transition," I replied graciously, before turning my attention to the rest of the team. "Now, let's discuss the immediate priorities for finance under our new structure." As I outlined the action items and deadlines, I could feel Thomas seething beside me. The man who had once told me I'd never succeed without him was now watching me command the room he'd considered his exclusive territory. The man who had walked out on me and our teenage daughter was now experiencing a fraction of the powerlessness I'd felt that sunny afternoon 5 years ago. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough to balance the scales, but it was a beginning. And as I caught the flash of grudging respect in the eyes of several team members, I knew that the most satisfying victory wouldn't be in humiliating Thomas, but in succeeding where he had failed, in building what he had tried to destroy, both at Pinnacle Solutions and in my own life. As I entered the gleaming headquarters building, employees nodded respectfully, unaware of the storm brewing beneath Pinnacle's polished surface. My second day as majority shareholder was about to begin, and with it, the real battle for the company's future. I arrived at Pinnacle headquarters 30 minutes before my scheduled meeting with Eleanor Wright. The morning sun glinted off the steel and glass tower, illuminating the company logo, a stylized peak with lines flowing through it, meant to symbolize the pinnacle of financial solutions. The irony wasn't lost on me. The company that had once promised to revolutionize financial technology had been secretly sabotaging its own future. My new executive assistant, Alex Porter, waited for me at the elevator with a tablet in hand and determination in his eyes. I'd specifically requested him for this role after reviewing personnel files and discovering Thomas had twice blocked his promotion despite stellar performance reviews. "Good morning, Ms. Anderson," he said, falling into step beside me as we headed toward my office. "I've gathered the files you requested on the R&D funding history, and Ms. Wright is already waiting in your office." "Thank you, Alex," I replied, setting a brisk pace. After my meeting with Eleanor, I'll need to see the operational assessment for Mr. Anderson's department from the last 3 quarters. The raw data, not the summarized reports. "All ready on your desk," he said with the hint of a smile. "And I've taken the liberty of highlighting the discrepancies between the raw numbers and what was presented to the board." I glanced at him with newfound appreciation. "You've been tracking these issues yourself?" "Let's just say some of us have been waiting a long time for someone to notice what's been happening," he replied carefully. The office that now belonged to me still bore traces of its previous occupant: the weathered leather furniture, the old-fashioned globe bar in the corner, the collection of industry awards lining one wall. But I'd made one significant change. Where the previous CEO had displayed photographs of himself with politicians and industry leaders, I'd placed a single picture of Olivia on her first day of law school, her smile radiating confidence despite the difficult circumstances of our life. Eleanor rose from the visitor's chair as I entered, her imposing presence somewhat diminished by age, but her shrewd eyes as sharp as ever. At 68, she still commanded respect throughout the industry, making her endorsement crucial to my acceptance by Pinnacle's old guard. "Rebecca," she greeted me, extending her hand. "Congratulations again on your acquisition. I hear you made quite an impression yesterday." "Thank you, Eleanor," I replied, shaking her hand firmly before settling behind my desk. "But I suspect you didn't come here for small talk." She chuckled, resuming her seat. "Direct as always. It's why I've always believed in you." Her expression grew serious. "I assume you've started to notice certain irregularities in our financial reporting, particularly regarding the R&D division?" I confirmed. Funds allocated but never actually deployed, promising projects mysteriously stalled, talent reassigned or pushed out, and all of it concealed through creative accounting. Eleanor nodded grimly. "I began noticing patterns about 2 years ago, subtle at first, then increasingly brazen. But by the time I had enough evidence to take to the board, I discovered something even more troubling." She leaned forward. 3 board members have financial ties to competing traditional banking companies. The revelation didn't surprise me as much as it should have. "Is that why you retired rather than confronting the issue directly?" "Partially," she admitted. "But mostly because I realized Pinnacle needed someone completely outside the existing power structure. Someone with the skills to turn the company around and the personal motivation to expose what's been happening regardless of the consequences." I raised an eyebrow. "Personal motivation?" Eleanor's weathered face broke into a knowing smile. "Don't misunderstand me, Rebecca. Your qualifications are impeccable. But when I saw Summit Strategy Group on the short list of potential acquirers, I recognized an opportunity. Thomas Anderson has been the linchpin in this corruption. Who better to dismantle his operation than the woman he underestimated so severely?" The realization hit me with surprising force. "You knew about our history?" "Financial tech is a small world," she replied with a shrug. "People talk, especially about a rising star like yourself who managed to build a successful consulting firm while raising a child alone after her husband left her for his assistant." She studied my expression. "Does it bother you that I considered your personal history in my recommendation to the board?" I thought about this carefully. "It would if that were the only reason, but it's not, is it?" "Not even close," Eleanor confirmed. "I've been watching your career for years. Your work at Summit was revolutionary, and your strategic vision saved at least 3 companies from bankruptcy. You were the most qualified candidate by a significant margin. Your history with Thomas was simply fortuitous." I couldn't help but smile at her choice of words. There had been nothing fortuitous about the pain of Thomas's betrayal, the struggle of single motherhood, or the years of rebuilding my life from the ground up. But there was undeniable poetry in finding myself here now, positioned to hold him accountable for both his personal and professional betrayals. "I need to know, Eleanor," I said, leaning forward. "How deep does this go? Who can I trust?" She slid a flash drive across the desk. "Everything I've gathered is here. Financial records, email correspondence, meeting notes. It's not enough for legal action yet, but it's a starting point." She paused. "As for who you can trust, Jennifer Martinez in HR has been quietly documenting the personnel side of things. And there's a young developer in R&D, Zachary Turner, who's been fighting to keep his blockchain project alive despite constant obstruction." I pocketed the flash drive. "And the board?" "Divided," Eleanor said. 3 are compromised, 4 are oblivious, and 2, Richard Blackwood and Amelia Morrison, suspected enough to support Summit's acquisition despite significant pushback. Our conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Alex entered, his expression tense. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation developing. Mr. Anderson has called an emergency finance team meeting and is telling the team that the restructuring has been temporarily paused pending board review." My jaw tightened. Not even 24 hours, and Thomas was already attempting to undermine my authority. It was exactly the kind of manipulative power play he'd specialized in during our marriage, creating confusion about decisions we'd made together, rewriting history to suit his narrative. "Where is this meeting happening?" I asked, rising from my chair. "Conference room C, East Wing," Alex replied. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Planning to crash the party?" "I'm the majority shareholder," I replied, gathering my tablet. "It's not crashing if it's my company." Eleanor's expression showed a mixture of approval and concern. "Just remember, Thomas knows how to provoke you. He'll try to make you look emotional, unstable." I smiled grimly, remembering how Thomas had weaponized my emotions against me during arguments, dismissing valid concerns as overreactions. Not anymore. That Rebecca is gone. The walk to Conference Room C gave me time to compose my strategy. This confrontation would set the tone for everything that followed. I needed to be authoritative without seeming vindictive, firm without appearing personal. The sweet satisfaction of exposing Thomas would come through results, not emotional outbursts. I could hear Thomas's voice through the door before I opened it, confident, persuasive, with that familiar undertone of condescension he always used when explaining why his way was the only sensible approach. "Simply a matter of timing," he was saying. "The board agrees that such dramatic changes require more thorough analysis. Ms. Anderson is new to our industry and doesn't fully understand." I pushed the door open, stepping into the sudden silence with measured confidence. 20 faces turned toward me, expressions ranging from surprise to discomfort to, in a few cases, poorly concealed satisfaction at Thomas's ambush being interrupted. "Please don't let me interrupt," I said, pleasantly, moving to the empty chair at the head of the table, the chair that should have been left vacant in the majority shareholder's absence. "I'm always eager to hear Mr. Anderson's perspective on board decisions." Thomas's face flushed, though he quickly recovered. "Rebecca, we were just discussing implementation timelines for the restructuring." "How interesting," I replied, setting my tablet on the table. "Especially since I've just come from updating the board on the accelerated timeline. They're quite enthusiastic about the changes." It wasn't entirely true. I hadn't spoken with the board this morning, but neither was Thomas's claim of the restructuring being paused. I glanced around the table, noting who looked uncomfortable with my arrival and who seemed relieved. Since we're all here, this is an excellent opportunity to clarify the new reporting structure and priorities. Without waiting for permission, I connected my tablet to the room's display system. The organizational chart I'd presented yesterday appeared on the screen, with one significant addition: a detailed timeline for implementation with today's date highlighted. "As you can see," I continued smoothly, "these changes are not pending review. They are in effect as of yesterday's acquisition closing. I believe you'll find your new office is ready, Mr. Anderson. Alex can show you where it's located after our meeting." The struggle played out visibly on Thomas's face, the impulse to challenge me publicly warring with the realization that doing so would only undermine his position further. It was the same expression he'd worn the day I'd refused to sign over, full ownership of our house during divorce negotiations, when he'd realized his usual intimidation tactics wouldn't work anymore. "Of course," he finally managed, his smile tight. "I must have misunderstood the timeline." "An understandable confusion during periods of transition," I replied graciously, before turning my attention to the rest of the team. "Now, let's discuss the immediate priorities for finance under our new structure." As I outlined the action items and deadlines, I could feel Thomas seething beside me. The man who had once told me I'd never succeed without him was now watching me command the room he'd considered his exclusive territory. The man who had walked out on me and our teenage daughter was now experiencing a fraction of the powerlessness I'd felt that sunny afternoon 5 years ago. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough to balance the scales, but it was a beginning. And as I caught the flash of grudging respect in the eyes of several team members, I knew that the most satisfying victory wouldn't be in humiliating Thomas, but in succeeding where he had failed, in building what he had tried to destroy, both at Pinnacle Solutions and in my own life. The operations meeting concluded with Thomas making a hasty exit, muttering something about existing appointments. I remained in the conference room as the team filed out, many lingering to ask questions about the new structure, questions they'd clearly been afraid to raise under Thomas's leadership. When the last person left, I allowed myself a moment alone to absorb what had just happened. My hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline ebbed. I'd expected resistance from Thomas, but the brazenness of his attempt to undermine me had caught me off guard. It was all too reminiscent of our marriage. The gaslighting, the attempts to speak for me, the casual dismissal of my competence. My mind drifted back to the day we'd met 15 years earlier. I'd been presenting a marketing strategy at a financial services conference in Chicago. Thomas, already rising through the ranks at Heritage Banking, had approached me afterward with that charming smile that would eventually become so familiar. "Impressive work," he'd said, his confidence immediately attractive to a young marketing specialist. "Though you might want to consider the practical implementation challenges." Theory doesn't always translate to real-world banking. Even then, wrapped in a compliment had been the subtle undermining that would become his hallmark. But I'd been too flattered by his attention to notice the red flag. Our whirlwind romance had progressed quickly. Dinner dates at expensive restaurants, weekend getaways to coastal towns, passionate conversations about transforming the financial industry through innovation. Thomas had seemed so progressive then, so aligned with my vision. I'd been completely taken in by his performance. 6 months later, we were married. I'd just been offered a position at a promising financial marketing firm. Take the Heritage. Offer instead, Thomas had urged, referring to the entry-level position his bank had extended. Sure, it pays less initially, but I'm on the inside. I can help your career advance much faster. I'd hesitated, torn between the exciting startup, where I'd have more autonomy, and the established company where my new husband worked. In the end, I'd chosen the marketing firm, my first real act of independence in our relationship. Thomas had been supportive outwardly, but something had shifted between us. Looking back, I realized that was the moment he began to see me as competition rather than a partner. The next several years had been a carefully choreographed dance, Thomas advancing at Heritage, me building my marketing career. On the surface, we were the perfect power couple, young and ambitious, frequently featured in business publications as rising stars. Behind closed doors, the reality had been very different. Every success I achieved was met with subtle diminishment. That's great, honey, though of course they're a smaller company with lower standards. Every setback became evidence of my limitations. Maybe this is a sign you should consider a less demanding role, especially now that we're talking about starting a family. Olivia had been planned, a mutual decision during what I thought was a strong period in our marriage. I'd just been appointed marketing director for my firm, a role that would require dedication and long hours. Thomas's reaction to the pregnancy, news had seemed supportive at first. "This is perfect timing," he declared. "You've been working too hard anyway. Now you have a reason to step back." When I'd explained that I planned to continue with my career after maternity leave, his true feelings had emerged. "Be realistic, Rebecca. No client will take you seriously once you're a mother. Your priorities will need to change." The arguments had escalated over the following months, each one ending the same way. with Thomas positioning himself as the voice of reason while painting me as emotional and unrealistic. His favorite phrase became a constant refrain. "You're not thinking clearly. The pregnancy hormones are affecting your judgment." The breaking point had come during Olivia's high school graduation. I'd successfully built my own marketing consultancy, despite Thomas's prediction that I would fail, proving that motherhood hadn't diminished my capability. Olivia had thrived too, earning academic honors and a scholarship to a prestigious university. I'd arrived at the ceremony expecting to celebrate our daughter's achievement with Thomas, only to find him seated with Jessica, his executive assistant. Their body language had made their relationship unmistakable. The pain of that public betrayal, watching my husband's infidelity revealed at an event meant to celebrate our daughter, had been excruciating. Later, when confronted, Thomas had the audacity to suggest I should have expected it. "We've been drifting apart for years, Rebecca. You've been so focused on your career instead of our marriage. Jessica understands the demands of my position." Somehow, in Thomas's narrative, my dedication to my work had justified his betrayal. Even more incredibly, he'd expected me to understand, to forgive him and focus on maintaining appearances for the sake of his professional image. The divorce that followed had stripped away all pretense between us. Every resentment Thomas harbored about my success, every limitation he believed motherhood should impose on me, every doubt he'd planted about my abilities, all of it poured out in a torrent of revelations. "Face reality, Rebecca," he'd finally snapped when I refused to accept his insulting settlement offer. "No judge will award you half our assets when I've been the primary breadwinner. You need me far more than I need you." He'd taken Jessica with him, broadcasting their relationship publicly with a speed that suggested he'd been planning his exit for some time. The divorce had been difficult, stress compounding the emotional trauma, isolation deepening as mutual. Friends chose sides. Thomas had crafted a narrative that painted him as the victim of a career-obsessed wife who'd neglected their marriage. Many had believed him. A knock on the conference room door pulled me from these memories. Alex stood in the doorway, his expression concerned. "Ms. Anderson, your next meeting starts in 5 minutes." I nodded, gathering my materials. "Thank you, Alex." "Also," he added hesitantly, "Mr. Anderson asked me to give you this." He handed me a folded note. He was quite insistent. I unfolded the paper, recognizing Thomas's neat handwriting immediately. "Rebecca, we need to talk privately. This hostile takeover of my department is unnecessary and unprofessional. I understand you may have personal grievances, but bringing them into the workplace only damages the company we both care about. Let's discuss a more reasonable transition over dinner tonight." Thomas, I couldn't help but laugh at his audacity. The familiar manipulation techniques, the attempt to position himself as the reasonable party, the implication that my decisions were emotional rather than strategic. The note could have been written 5 years ago. He still saw me through the same distorted lens. Alex raised an eyebrow at my reaction. Should I prepare a response? I folded the note and tucked it into my pocket. "No response necessary. Mr. Anderson will receive my answer through actions rather than words." As I walked to my next meeting, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The pain of the past couldn't be erased, but it had forged me into someone stronger than Thomas could ever comprehend. He still believed he was dealing with the woman he'd abandoned, uncertain, emotionally vulnerable, easy to manipulate. His failure to recognize how completely I'd transformed would be his undoing, and watching that realization dawn on him day by day would be the sweetest form of justice. My next meeting was scheduled with the Technology Innovation Team, the division that had suffered most under Thomas's leadership. I'd deliberately chosen to meet them in their workspace rather than summon them to the executive floor, wanting to see firsthand the conditions they'd been working in. The elevator took me down to the 4th floor, a stark contrast to the polished marble and gleaming surfaces of the executive level. Here, the carpet was worn, the lighting harsh fluorescent, The workstations cramped and outdated. Even the air felt different, stale with the faint metallic tang of overheated electronics and too many people in too small a space. As I stepped off the elevator, conversations hushed and heads turned. News of my confrontation with Thomas had clearly traveled. Fast! I could feel the weight of evaluating gazes, some hopeful, others skeptical, all curious about the new majority shareholder who had demoted their former CFO. I followed Alex through a maze of cubicles to a glass-walled conference room that had seen better days. The blinds were yellowed with age, several chairs mismatched, the presentation screen showing visible scratches. It was exactly the kind of subtle resource deprivation Thomas excelled at. Not obvious enough to trigger formal complaints, but persistent enough to undermine morale and productivity. Inside waited 5 people, the core innovation team that had somehow managed to keep developing financial technology despite systematic obstruction. I recognized Zachary Turner immediately from his personnel file. Mid-30s, earnest expression, behind wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of brilliant developer who cared more about solving problems than office politics. "Ms. Anderson," he said, rising to shake my hand. "We're honored you wanted to meet with us directly." His tone carried a mixture of hope and wariness that spoke volumes about previous disappointments. "The honor is mine," I replied sincerely. "I've reviewed your team's work from the past 3 years. What you've managed to accomplish with limited resources is nothing short of remarkable." I saw surprise ripple across their faces, followed by cautious pleasure. When was the last time someone from the executive floor had actually acknowledged their efforts? For the next hour, I listened as they walked me through their current projects, challenges, and visions for the future. Their passion was palpable, their ideas innovative. What they lacked wasn't talent or drive, but the most basic resources: adequate funding, sufficient staff, and executive support. Our blockchain security protocol could reduce fraud by up to 47%, Zachary explained, spreading diagrams across the table. "We've been ready for full development for 18 months, but the funding keeps getting reallocated," I finished, "to more pressing priorities in traditional banking operations." He nodded, relief washing over his features at being understood. "Exactly. Every quarter we submit the proposal, every quarter we get preliminary approval, and every quarter the funds mysteriously disappear before implementation." I studied the diagrams, noting the elegant simplicity of the design. This wasn't just a good idea, it was potentially revolutionary. Exactly the kind of innovation Thomas had been systematically burying. "What would you need to have a working prototype within 3 months?" I asked. Zachary blinked, clearly caught off guard by the direct question. 3 months? With proper funding and staffing? He quickly calculated. About $1.8 million and freedom to pull in 4 additional developers. I made a note on my tablet. "Consider it done. Alex will work with you this afternoon to expedite the paperwork." The atmosphere in the room transformed instantly, skepticism giving way to stunned disbelief, then cautious excitement. These people had been fighting the same battles for so long that actual support from above seemed almost unreal. "There's something else you should know," said Maya Chen, a data systems engineer whose recommendations had been consistently overruled by Thomas. "The performance metrics for our existing digital banking platforms have been deliberately misrepresented in quarterly reports. They're actually performing 28% better than officially documented." I wasn't surprised, but the confirmation still sent a chill through me. "Let me guess. Someone wanted your innovations to appear less successful than they actually are?" Maya nodded grimly. The real numbers would have justified major expansion of the program. Instead, Mr. Anderson used the manipulated data to argue for maintaining our core business in traditional banking services. "Do you have documentation of the actual performance metrics?" I asked. In response, Zachary unlocked a drawer and pulled out a flash drive. We've been keeping parallel records for 2 years. Every test, every output measurement, all verified and timestamped. He hesitated before handing it to me. This could cost people their jobs. Some people should lose their jobs, I replied, accepting the drive. Starting with those who betrayed this company's future for personal gain. As I left the technology division an hour later, I could feel the shift in energy behind me, the spark of hope taking hold, the renewed sense of purpose. For years, these brilliant minds had been laboring under artificial constraints, their innovations systematically suppressed. Now they had a champion, and the atmosphere of resignation was giving way to possibility. The contrast to my next destination couldn't have been more striking. The finance department occupied the entire east wing of the 12th floor, spacious, recently renovated, with high-end furnishings and state-of-the-art technology. The message was clear in every detail. This was where the company's priorities and money had been directed. I paused in the doorway, observing the space before anyone noticed my presence. Executives occupied glass-walled offices along the perimeter, while their support staff worked in open-concept clusters at the center. The layout itself reinforced hierarchy and visibility. Those in power could observe everyone while remaining partially sheltered themselves. So typically, Thomas. The memory of our home office arrangement flashed through my mind, how he'd positioned my desk facing the wall while his commanded the room. At the time, he'd claimed it was to minimize my distractions. In retrospect, like so many of his actions, it had been about control and dominance. Thomas's new office was significantly smaller than his previous one, positioned among department managers rather than separated from them. Through the glass walls, I could see him engaged in intense conversation with Greg Phillips. Neither had noticed me yet. I observed them for a moment, noting Thomas's agitated gestures, the tightness around his mouth that always appeared when things weren't going his way. Greg kept shaking his head, glancing nervously toward the entrance where I stood. Whatever. Thomas was proposing. Greg wasn't comfortable with it. Eventually, Greg looked up and froze upon seeing me. Thomas, noticing his reaction, turned and locked eyes with me across the department floor. For a moment, neither of us moved, a silent acknowledgement of the changed power dynamic between us. I could have walked over, inserted myself into their conversation, demanded to know what they were discussing. The old Rebecca might have done exactly that, eager to prove she belonged in their world of executive decisions. The new Rebecca simply nodded coolly and continued her tour of the finance floor, letting them wonder what I'd seen and what I intended to do about it. The finance team watched me with undisguised curiosity as I moved among them, introducing myself, asking questions about their work. Many seemed surprised by my interest in their day-to-day activities, another indication of Thomas's leadership style. He had always been more concerned with results than process, with appearances than substance. Near the end of my visit, I paused at the desk of Jessica Palmer, Thomas's former assistant who had become his mistress, and was now, according to her personnel file, a financial communications specialist, a position created specifically for her with a salary far exceeding the standard for her experience level. She looked up from her computer, recognition and shock washing over her face as she realized who I was. We had never officially met, Thomas had made sure of that. But she certainly knew who I was, the woman whose husband she'd taken, whose marriage she'd helped destroy. Now I was standing at her desk with the power to destroy her career. Ms. Palmer, I said pleasantly. I'm Rebecca Anderson, Summit's CEO and Pinnacle's new majority shareholder. I've been introducing myself to the team. She stammered a response, her face flushing. Yes, Ms. Anderson. It's nice to meet you officially. The fear in her eyes was palpable, the awkwardness of our situation hanging heavily between us. 5 years ago, I'd fantasized about confronting her, screaming at her, making her feel a fraction of the pain and humiliation I'd experienced. Now, Facing her in this context, I felt nothing but a cool detachment. I've been reviewing the communications portfolio, I continued, my tone professional. I'd like a comprehensive report on your current initiatives by tomorrow morning, with measurable outcomes and ROI projections, please. The color drained from her face. We both knew there were no substantial projects to report on. Her position had been a convenient fiction created by Thomas to keep her close and well compensated. Of course, she managed. First thing tomorrow. I nodded and moved on, feeling her panicked gaze following me. Without looking back, I knew she would be reaching for her phone the moment I was out of sight, desperately texting Thomas about this unexpected confrontation. Let them worry. Let them scramble. The atmospheric pressure was shifting throughout Pinnacle Solutions, and everyone could feel it, from the renewed hope in the technology division to the growing unease in finance. Like the calm before a storm, these subtle changes presaged the greater transformation to come. And I was only just beginning. That evening, I returned to my office to find Jennifer waiting with 2 cups of coffee and a concerned expression. I heard about your tour of the departments today, she said, handing me one of the cups. Word travels fast, especially about the CEO personally approving a multi-million-dollar prototype that Thomas has been blocking for over a year. I smiled, taking a sip of the much-needed caffeine. Good. I want the message to spread. Things are changing at Pinnacle, and everyone needs to understand that. Thomas is already rallying his allies, Jennifer warned. He's called Greg Phillips, Harold Thompson from legal, and James Peterson from the board. They had drinks at the Capitol Grill after work. I expected as much, I replied, settling behind my desk. Thomas has never been one to accept defeat graciously. Jennifer studied me carefully. You don't seem concerned. Because I've been preparing for this moment longer than he realizes, I said, unlocking my desk drawer. I pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it, revealing a meticulously organized collection of documents. This is what I've been working on for the past 3 months, ever since Eleanor first approached me about acquiring Pinnacle. Jennifer moved closer, eyes widening as she scanned the contents. Rebecca, this is a comprehensive transformation plan. Detailed financial projections for expanding our digital portfolio, I confirmed. Performance metrics from competitors who've already made the transition, legal frameworks for the changes I'm implementing, and contingency plans for every form of resistance I anticipated. The portfolio represented hundreds of hours of work, late nights after Olivia was asleep, weekends spent analyzing industry data, consultations with experts in corporate law and financial technology. While Thomas had been comfortably ensconced in his executive position, believing himself untouchable, I had been methodically preparing his downfall. I've also been building my support network, I continued, flipping to a section that detailed key allies within Pinnacle and throughout the industry. Richard Blackwood and Amelia Morrison from the board are firmly behind the digital pivot. They've been quietly dissatisfied with our lagging performance compared to competitors. Jennifer shook her head, impressed. You're 3 steps ahead of them already. I have to be, I replied. Thomas underestimated me once before, and it cost me dearly. This time, the consequences will be his to bear. I reached for my phone as it buzzed with an incoming email. That should be the preliminary audit report I commissioned from Deloitte. I had them begin reviewing Pinnacle's financial records the moment I signed the acquisition papers. The email confirmed my suspicions. Significant discrepancies in how technology projects had been budgeted versus how funds had actually been deployed. Not enough evidence for criminal charges yet, but certainly enough to justify a more thorough investigation. I've also scheduled meetings with our 5 largest institutional investors for next week, I added, forwarding the audit report to Jennifer. They've been promised returns on technology investments that haven't materialized. When they understand why and who's responsible, Thomas will find his support rapidly evaporating. Jennifer looked at me with newfound appreciation. This isn't just about getting back at Thomas for you, is it? You genuinely want to transform Pinnacle. The two aren't mutually exclusive, I replied. The best justice isn't just about making Thomas face consequences. It's about succeeding where he failed, building what he tried to destroy. I closed the portfolio and added, and yes, I want to see the look on his face when he realizes that the woman he abandoned is the one who finally unleashed Pinnacle's potential. My phone buzzed again, a text from my neighbor who was watching Olivia's cat while she was at law school. She's asking when you'll be home. Says she needs to drop off the mail that was delivered to your place by mistake. Speaking of priorities, I said, showing Jennifer the message. The most important part of my life is waiting for me at home. As I gathered my things, Jennifer helped me organize the documents for tomorrow's executive committee meeting, the first major presentation of my vision for Pinnacle's future. Thomas will try to derail it, she warned. He's already working on a counterproposal that maintains traditional banking as our primary focus. Let him try, I replied confidently. I've anticipated his arguments and prepared responses for each one. More importantly, I have data he can't refute and board support he doesn't know about yet. Before leaving, I paused at the window overlooking the city. Lights twinkled in office buildings and apartments, thousands of people managing their finances, many of them using systems that companies like Pinnacle provided. You know, I said thoughtfully, when Thomas left me, he said I'd never succeed without him, that I wasn't cut out for balancing ambition and motherhood. I turned to Jennifer. What he never understood was that becoming Olivia's mother didn't diminish my capabilities. It enhanced them. I learned to be more efficient, more focused, more determined. And now you're using those same skills to run his company better than he ever could, Jennifer observed with a smile. Our company, I corrected. And yes, the irony isn't lost on me. The drive home gave me time to transition from CEO back to mom, a balancing act I'd perfected over the years. As I pulled into my modest suburban neighborhood, I reflected on how different my life was from what Thomas had envisioned for us. He'd wanted the mansion in the exclusive gated community, the status symbols, the power couple lifestyle. I'd chosen this instead. A comfortable home in a good school district, financial security without ostentation, and a life centered around Olivia's well-being rather than appearances. My neighbor Lisa was waiting on her porch when I arrived, a stack of mail in her hands. "Long day?" she asked sympathetically, handing me the envelopes. "Transformative," I replied with a smile. "How are things with you?" We chatted briefly about neighborhood news before I headed inside. Unlike Thomas, who had always compartmentalized his life, keeping work relationships and personal ones strictly separate, I valued these small connections, the grounding normalcy of community. Inside my home, I kicked off my heels and changed into comfortable clothes, another transition ritual. The professional armor I wore at Pinnacle stayed at the office. Here, I could simply be Rebecca, not the CEO or majority shareholder. I heated leftover pasta for dinner and settled at my kitchen table with the mail, bills, advertisements, and a thick envelope from Olivia's law school. Opening it, I found a program for an upcoming moot court competition with Olivia's name listed as a participant. Pride swelled in my chest. Despite everything she'd been through with her father's betrayal and the difficult years that followed, she was thriving, building her own path to success with the same determination I'd tried to model for her. I snapped a photo of the program and texted it to her with a simple message. "So proud of you. Can I come watch?" Her response came quickly. "Absolutely. It's next Friday at 2 p.m. Will that work with your Pinnacle takeover schedule?" I smiled at her directness. Nothing would keep me away. I'll be there. As I prepared for bed that night, I mentally reviewed the day's events and tomorrow's challenges. The executive committee meeting would be pivotal, my first real opportunity to present my comprehensive vision for Pinnacle's transformation. Thomas would be ready with objections, allied with Greg Phillips and likely several other executives, loyal to the old regime. But I had something they didn't: a clear view of the financial technology future and the determination to get there. 5 years ago, when Thomas had walked out, leaving me to face Olivia's pain and questions alone, I'd felt like my world was collapsing. The shame of his public betrayal, the financial uncertainty, the whispers from people who'd once called themselves friends, it had all seemed overwhelming. But from that darkest moment had come unexpected strength. I'd built Summit Strategy Group from nothing, helped other companies navigate digital transformation, and earned a reputation for visionary leadership. Now I would bring that same transformation to Pinnacle Solutions. And if that meant dismantling the kingdom Thomas had built on shaky ethics and misaligned priorities, so be it. The company deserved better. The employees deserved better. And frankly, so did I. The boardroom was already half full when I arrived the next morning, 20 minutes early for the executive committee meeting. I'd chosen my outfit deliberately, a tailored navy suit that projected authority without ostentation. Professional armor for what I knew would be a contentious discussion. I'd arranged the seating strategically, placing allies at key positions around the table. Documents waited at each place, personalized information packets containing both shared data and specific insights relevant to each executive's area of responsibility. It was a small touch, but one that demonstrated both thoroughness and consideration. Thomas and Greg arrived together, deep in conversation that abruptly halted when they noticed me. Their body language told me everything I needed to know. They'd prepared a coordinated response to my proposals. Thomas's confident smirk suggested he believed he had the upper hand. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said pleasantly. "Please find your designated seats. We have a lot to cover today." Thomas glanced at the seating chart, his expression darkening when he realized I'd separated him from Greg. Another small tactical advantage: they wouldn't be able to exchange notes or signals during the presentation. As the remaining executives filtered in, I observed their interactions carefully. Harold Thompson from legal kept checking his phone nervously. Lisa Martinez from marketing seemed genuinely curious, unaligned with either faction. Monica Chen from customer experience caught my eye and gave me a subtle nod of support. At precisely 9 a.m., I called the meeting to order. Thank you all for being here. Today we'll be discussing Pinnacle's transformation strategy for the next 3 years. You've all received the preliminary overview. Now I'd like to dive deeper into the specific initiatives that will drive our growth. I moved to the presentation screen, clicking through to the first substantive slide, a comparison of Pinnacle's performance against key competitors in the financial technology space. The data was stark, showing our declining market position in stark relief. As you can see, Pinnacle has been losing ground consistently over the past 5 years. While our competitors have embraced digital transformation, we've maintained an over-reliance on traditional banking services that are becoming increasingly commoditized. Thomas shifted in his seat, clearly impatient to interject. I continued before he could interrupt. This isn't merely about following trends. It's about survival. The financial institutions that fail to adapt to changing consumer demands and technological possibilities won't exist in 10 years. I clicked to the next slide, showing a comprehensive digital transformation roadmap with clear phases, milestones, and metrics. This is what success looks like. We'll begin with infrastructure modernization, progress to customer experience reimagination, and culminate in new business model innovation. Each phase has specific deliverables and ROI projections. Harold Thompson cleared his throat, the first to break the silence. These projections seem optimistic, Ms. Anderson. The implementation costs alone would represent a significant investment. They're not optimistic, Mr. Thompson. They're realistic, I replied, moving to the next slide. These are the actual results from 3 mid-sized banks that underwent similar transformations. In each case, the initial investment was recouped within 18 months, and long-term profitability increased by an average of 34%. I could see Thomas growing more agitated as I methodically addressed each potential objection before he could raise it. Finally, he could contain himself no longer. "This proposal represents a fundamental departure from Pinnacle's core strengths," he said, his tone carrying that familiar condescension. "Our stability comes from our traditional banking services, which have consistently delivered reliable returns to shareholders. This plan would dilute our focus and increase our risk profile significantly." I smiled, having anticipated exactly this argument. "Let's look at the data on that point, shall we?" I clicked to a slide showing Pinnacle's traditional banking returns against market benchmarks. Our traditional services have underperformed the market by 12% over the past 5 years. Meanwhile, the digital initiatives we did implement, despite limited resources, outperformed projections by 28%. The room grew noticeably quiet as executives studied the numbers. I had deliberately chosen metrics that couldn't be disputed. They came directly from Pinnacle's own financial reports, though I'd analyzed and presented them in ways that revealed their true significance. Additionally, I continued, these initiatives align perfectly with changing customer expectations. Our latest satisfaction surveys show that 72% of customers under 45 consider digital capabilities their primary factor in choosing a financial institution. I moved through the presentation methodically, outlining the specific changes each department would undergo, the resources they would receive, and the outcomes expected. When I reached the finance section, Thomas leaned forward, clearly preparing another objection. "The finance department will undergo the most significant reorganization," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "Not only will it be divided into traditional and digital divisions, but will also implement a new accountability framework to ensure transparent resource allocation." Thomas's eyes narrowed at the implication. "Are you suggesting there's been something improper about our resource allocation process?" It was the opening I'd been waiting for. "I'm suggesting we need better alignment between strategic priorities and actual investments. For instance," I clicked to a slide showing a detailed analysis of 3 major digital initiatives from the past 2 years, their approved budgets, their actual funding after reallocations, and their eventual outcomes. Project Phoenix was approved for $4, $2 million, but ultimately received only $1, $8 million after multiple reallocations. Despite this 57% reduction, it still delivered a 22% return. Imagine what it could have accomplished with full funding. The executives were now fully engaged, several leaning forward to study the numbers more carefully. This wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was about revealing a pattern that had systematically undermined Pinnacle's potential. "I've analyzed every major initiative from the past 3 years," I continued, advancing to another damning slide. "In every case, funds were diverted from digital projects to traditional services, despite the board's clear directive to prioritize digital transformation." Thomas's face had grown increasingly flushed. These reallocations were all properly documented and approved through appropriate channels. In a dynamic business environment, priorities must sometimes shift based on market conditions. Interesting that these market conditions consistently shifted funds away from innovation and toward maintaining the status quo, I replied evenly, particularly when those maintaining the status quo received performance bonuses based on short-term metrics. Lisa Martinez spoke up for the first time. "These are serious concerns, Ms. Anderson. Are you suggesting there was a deliberate effort to undermine our digital strategy?" I chose my words carefully. "I'm suggesting that our incentive structures created conflicts of interest that may have influenced decision-making. The data speaks for itself." Greg Phillips attempted to shift the focus. "While historical analysis has its place, Perhaps we should focus on moving forward constructively, rather than dwelling on past decisions made under different leadership. Understanding our past is essential to charting our future, I countered. If we don't acknowledge the systematic issues that brought us here, we risk repeating them. I advanced to the next section of the presentation, the detailed implementation plan for the first 90 days. This is where we begin the transformation, with clear, measurable objectives for each department. You'll find your specific deliverables in the customized packets at your places. As the executives leafed through their individual plans, I could see a mixture of reactions: concern from Thomas's allies, excitement from those who had felt constrained by the old regime, cautious optimism from the neutral parties. I encourage you all to review these carefully and come to our follow-up sessions with questions and input, I said. This transformation will require all of us working together. Those who embrace the change will find tremendous opportunity for growth and advancement. The unspoken corollary hung in the air. Those who resisted would find themselves increasingly marginalized. Thomas made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. Before we proceed with such radical changes, I believe we should commission an independent analysis of these proposals. My team has prepared a more measured approach that balances innovation with stability. I turned to him with a polite smile. Your input is valuable, Thomas. However, the board has already approved this transformation strategy based on the extensive analysis already conducted. We're not here to debate whether to change, but how best to implement that change. The look on Thomas's face was priceless, a mixture of shock, fury, and dawning comprehension. He'd been outmaneuvered so completely that he hadn't even realized the battle was already lost. If there are no further questions, I concluded, I'd like to schedule individual meetings with each of you over the next 3 days to discuss your department's specific role in the transformation. Alex will coordinate the scheduling. As the meeting adjourned and executives filed out, Thomas remained seated, staring at the data still displayed on the screen. I gathered my materials unhurriedly, giving him the opportunity to approach me if he chose. You deliberately blindsided me, he finally said, his voice low to avoid being overheard by the few remaining executives. I presented a comprehensive strategy based on thorough analysis, I replied calmly. Your interpretation of that as a personal attack is interesting. Don't play games, Rebecca. We both know what this is about. I paused, considering my response carefully. This is about Pinnacle's future, Thomas. Nothing more, nothing less. Though I won't deny there's a certain symmetry to the situation. Symmetry? He scoffed. 5 years ago, you made decisions that served your personal interests at the expense of your family's well-being. Now I'm revealing how you've made decisions that served your personal interests at the expense of this company's well-being. The common denominator isn't me, Thomas. It's you. His face darkened. You have no idea what you're talking about. I've dedicated my career to Pinnacle. You've dedicated your career to Thomas Anderson. I corrected him. There's a difference. I closed my laptop and headed for the door, then paused. By the way, I'll need that report from Jessica by end of day. Unless, of course, there's nothing substantive to report on her financial communications work. I left him there, stewing in the realization that his carefully constructed kingdom was crumbling beneath him, one presentation slide at a time. The rest of the morning passed in a whirlwind of meetings and calls. Word of the executive committee presentation spread quickly throughout Pinnacle, creating a buzz of anticipation and anxiety. Change always generated both excitement and fear, and I needed to manage both emotions carefully to maintain momentum. By lunchtime, I had received messages from both Richard Blackwood and Amelia Morrison, the board members Eleanor had identified as allies, congratulating me on the clarity and boldness of the transformation strategy. Their support would be crucial in the weeks ahead, especially as Thomas inevitably attempted to undermine my authority with other board members. I was just finishing a working lunch at my desk when Alex appeared at my door with a concerned expression. "Ms. Anderson, Jessica Palmer is here to see you. She says it's urgent." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. I hadn't expected Thomas's girlfriend to confront me directly. "Send her in, please." Jessica entered hesitantly, looking far less confident than she had at Olivia's graduation 5 years ago. Then, she'd been proudly holding Thomas's hand, secure in her new position as his chosen partner. Now, she clutched a thin folder like a shield. "Thank you for seeing me," she began, her voice slightly tremulous. "I have the report you requested." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Please, sit down." She perched on the edge of the seat, placing the folder on my desk. "I've outlined my work over the past year as requested, but..." She hesitated. "I think we both know there isn't much substance to report." Her candor surprised me. "That's refreshingly honest, Jessica." She met my gaze directly for the first time. "Thomas created the position for me. I knew it then, and I know it now. What I didn't know until recently was how many other decisions he's made that weren't in the company's best interest." This was an unexpected development. I studied her carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or deception. "Why are you telling me this?" She took a deep breath. "Because things between Thomas and me have changed. After the acquisition was announced, he became different. Obsessed with undermining you, talking about you constantly. It made me realize that he never really got over you." I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. "Jessica, Thomas didn't love me when we were married. He loved the idea of me, the supportive wife who would prioritize his career over her own ambitions. When I stopped fitting that mold, he found you." She flinched slightly at my bluntness. "I thought we had something real, but now I'm wondering if I was just convenient, a way to boost his ego. Why come to me with this? What are you hoping to achieve?" She straightened in her chair, gathering her courage. "I have information about what Thomas and Greg have been doing, the projects they've sabotaged, the funds they've diverted. I want to make a deal." Now we were getting to the real purpose of her visit. "What kind of deal?" "Immunity," she said simply. "I helped Thomas hide some of the financial manipulations. I didn't fully understand what I was doing at first, but eventually I did, and I continued anyway. I don't want to lose everything because of his mistakes. And mine." I considered her request carefully. Her information could be valuable, but trusting Thomas's girlfriend, the woman who had participated in destroying my marriage, required a leap of faith I wasn't sure I was prepared to make. "Why should I believe you're not here on Thomas's behalf? This could easily be a setup to discredit me." She pulled a USB drive from her pocket and placed it on my desk. "Because I brought receipts, email threads, modified financial reports, calendar entries for meetings with competitors that weren't disclosed to the board. Thomas doesn't know I kept these. He always underestimated me, just like he underestimated you." The parallel wasn't lost on me. Thomas had a pattern of dismissing women's capabilities, only to be blindsided when they proved more observant and strategic than he anticipated. "I'll need our legal team to review this material," I said, pocketing the drive without committing to her immunity request. "If it proves valuable, we can discuss appropriate arrangements." She nodded, recognizing it was the best offer she would get. "There's one more thing you should know. Thomas and Greg are meeting with James Peterson from the board this afternoon. They're planning to challenge your authority directly, claiming you have a personal vendetta that's clouding your business judgment." "Let them try," I replied, unperturbed. "The data speaks for itself." Jessica rose to leave, then hesitated. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about what happened with Thomas. I truly believed he was unhappy in your marriage. It took me years to realize he's just chronically dissatisfied, always wanting something he doesn't have, then losing interest once he gets it. Her insight was surprisingly perceptive. That's an expensive lesson to learn. "Tell me about it," she said with a wry smile. 5 years of my life I won't get back. After she left, I sat contemplating this unexpected development. Jessica's defection represented a significant crack in Thomas's support system. If she had indeed kept evidence of his financial manipulations, it could accelerate the timeline for removing him from Pinnacle entirely. I called Jennifer to my office, briefing her on the surprising meeting. "Do you think she's genuine?" Jennifer asked skeptically. "I think she's genuinely looking out for herself," I replied, "which makes her information more credible, not less." Self-preservation is a powerful motivator. I handed her the USB drive. "Have our most discreet IT person verify the contents, then pass it to legal for review. I want a preliminary assessment by end of day." Jennifer took the drive, her expression concerned. "Be careful, Rebecca. If Thomas feels cornered, there's no telling how he might react." "I'm counting on it," I said. "The more desperate he becomes, the more mistakes he'll make. Every error simply strengthens our position." After Jennifer left, I returned to the transformation strategy documents, refining the implementation timelines. Based on feedback from the morning's presentation, I was deep in concentration when my phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. "Dad just called me, wanted to explain his side before I heard things from you. Should I be concerned?" My heart sank. Of course Thomas would drag Olivia into this, attempting to use our daughter as leverage. It was exactly the kind of manipulation he excelled at, creating emotional pressure points to distract me from my objectives. I typed a careful response. "Your father is experiencing professional challenges related to Pinnacle's new direction. It's natural he'd want your support. You don't need to choose sides. Love you." Her reply came quickly. "Already told him my internship applications are keeping me too busy for corporate drama. Love you too." I smiled at her response. Olivia had grown into a woman who could set boundaries even with her father, a skill I had taken far too long to develop myself. The afternoon brought a series of departmental meetings, each focused on specific aspects of the transformation strategy. The technology team was particularly energized, bringing additional ideas that would enhance the digital banking platform. The marketing team needed more convincing, but eventually embraced the opportunity to reposition Pinnacle as an innovation leader. It was nearly 5 p.m. when Richard Blackwood called from the board. His tone was grave. "Rebecca, I wanted to give you a heads up. Thomas and Greg met with James Peterson today. They're pushing for an emergency board meeting to review your leadership approach." "On what grounds?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "They're claiming you have a personal vendetta against Thomas that's influencing your business decisions. They've portrayed the transformation strategy as recklessly aggressive and financially unsound." "And how did James respond?" "He was non-committal," Richard replied. "Said he'd consider their concerns and consult with other board members. You should know they're gaining some traction with the more conservative directors." "Thank you for the warning," I said. "When do you expect this meeting might be called?" "They're pushing for Friday. I've suggested next week to give everyone time to review the relevant materials properly." "Perfect," I replied. "By then, I'll have preliminary results from the audit to share with the board." "Audit?" Richard sounded surprised. "What audit?" "The one I commissioned from Deloitte before the acquisition closed. It's uncovering some very interesting patterns in how digital initiatives have been funded, or rather, underfunded, over the past 3 years." There was a moment of silence as Richard processed this information. "You anticipated this challenge." "I anticipated everything," I confirmed. "Thomas is nothing if not predictable." After ending the call, I leaned back in my chair, contemplating my next moves. The board meeting would be the decisive battleground. The moment when all the evidence I'd been gathering would be presented in a forum Thomas couldn't control or manipulate. I opened my laptop and composed an email to the legal team, copying the CFO I'd brought with me from Summit. It was time to accelerate the audit findings and prepare the most damning evidence for presentation to the board. Thomas had declared war, but he was fighting the last battle with outdated weapons. He still believed this was about personality and politics, areas where his charm and manipulation had always served him well. He hadn't yet realized this was about data and performance, areas where no amount of smooth talking could obscure the truth. As I left the office that evening, I felt a curious sense of calm. The confrontation I'd been preparing for was finally at hand, and I was more than ready. Thomas had always underestimated me, from our marriage through our divorce, and now in our professional confrontation. It was a mistake he would never have the opportunity to make again. The next 3 days passed in a blur of strategic meetings, evidence gathering, and careful coalition building. By Thursday evening, I had solidified support from key executives, prepared comprehensive materials for the board, and received the preliminary audit findings, which were even more damning than I'd anticipated. Friday morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the storm I knew was brewing in the Pinnacle boardroom. I dressed with particular care, a tailored charcoal suit that projected both authority and composure. Today would be the decisive battle for Pinnacle's future, and I intended to leave nothing to chance. Jennifer met me in the lobby, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. Legal just finished reviewing Jessica's evidence. It corroborates everything the audit found and adds a personal dimension. Emails where Thomas and Greg explicitly discuss undermining digital initiatives to protect their bonuses. Perfect timing, I replied as we stepped into the elevator. Send the most incriminating excerpts to my tablet. I want them ready if Thomas tries to make this personal. The boardroom was tense when I arrived, 15 minutes early as planned. I wanted to be settled and composed when Thomas and his allies arrived. I arranged my materials meticulously, the evidence organized for maximum impact. Board members filtered, in gradually, their expressions revealing little. Richard Blackwood gave me a subtle nod of encouragement as he took his seat. Amelia Morrison's face remained impassive, though I knew from our private conversations that she fully supported the transformation strategy. Thomas arrived with Greg and James Peterson, the three of them deep in conversation that halted abruptly when they noticed me. Thomas looked confident, too confident for someone about to face the evidence I'd compiled. It made me wonder what he thought he knew that I didn't. At precisely 10 a.m., William Harper, the board chairman, called the meeting to order. His expression was grave as he addressed the room. We're here today to address concerns raised about Pinnacle's new strategic direction under Ms. Anderson's leadership. This is highly unusual so soon after an acquisition, but given the significance of the changes proposed, the board has agreed to review the situation. He turned to Thomas. Mr. Anderson, since you requested this meeting, perhaps you should begin. Thomas rose, straightening his tie in that nervous gesture I remembered so well from our marriage. He approached the presentation screen with practiced confidence. Thank you, Chairman Harper, esteemed board members, he began. I come before you today with serious concerns about the direction Ms. Anderson is taking our company. Concerns shared by many long-serving executives who have built Pinnacle into the institution it is today. He clicked to his first slide, a bar graph showing Pinnacle's steady, if unspectacular, growth over the past decade. Under previous leadership, we maintained a balanced approach that delivered consistent returns to shareholders while gradually incorporating technological advancements. His next slide showed an alarmist projection of declining profits and increasing costs. The radical restructuring Ms. Anderson proposes represents an existential threat to this stability. The massive investment in unproven technologies, coupled with the dismantling of our core revenue streams, creates unacceptable risk. I watched calmly as Thomas continued his presentation, noting how he carefully framed the transformation strategy as reckless and personally motivated. It was a masterful performance, poised, reasonable, and utterly misleading. When he finally concluded, several board members were nodding along with his assessment. James Peterson immediately spoke up in support. "I've reviewed the financial projections, and I share Tom's concerns. The ROI timelines seem unrealistic, and the risk profile is concerning." William Harper turned to me. "Ms. Anderson, how do you respond to these concerns?" I rose unhurriedly, my tablet in hand. "I appreciate Mr. Anderson's perspective, though I'm surprised he feels qualified to critique a digital transformation strategy given his documented history of undermining such initiatives." Thomas's expression flickered briefly before returning to careful neutrality. I continued, connecting my tablet to the display. "Before addressing the strategy itself, I believe it's important to understand the context in which Pinnacle has been operating. The audit commissioned prior to acquisition completion has revealed some troubling patterns." My first slide appeared, a detailed analysis of how funds approved for digital initiatives had been systematically diverted over the past 3 years. As you can see, despite the board's clear directive to accelerate digital transformation, 73% of allocated funds were redirected to traditional banking operations under Mr. Anderson's authority. Several board members leaned forward, studying the data with growing concern. I advanced to the next slide, a comparison of performance metrics between properly funded digital projects and those that had been starved of resources. Even with insufficient funding, our digital initiatives outperformed traditional services by an average of 34%. Imagine what they could have achieved with the full resources approved by this very board. I could see the tide beginning to turn as the evidence mounted. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat as I methodically dismantled his claims of prudent resource management. "This isn't merely poor judgment," I continued, advancing to the most damning evidence. "It represents a deliberate effort to sabotage Pinnacle's digital future for personal gain." The boardroom fell silent as emails appeared on screen. Correspondence between Thomas and Greg explicitly discussing how to redirect funds while maintaining the appearance of digital investment. "We need to keep the digital budget line items in place for board approval," Thomas had written. "But we can shift 60% to operating expenses post-approval. No one checks the details once the quarter is underway." Thomas's face had drained of color. "Where did you get those emails? That's private correspondence." "They were provided by a concerned employee," I replied calmly. "One who grew uncomfortable with being asked to misrepresent financial allocations." I didn't mention Jessica by name, but Thomas's eyes widened with realization. The betrayal from his girlfriend had clearly blindsided him. William Harper's expression had grown increasingly grave. "Mr. Anderson, these allegations are extremely serious. Do you deny the authenticity of these communications?" Thomas fumbled for a response, his composure cracking. "Those emails are taken completely out of context. We were discussing temporary reallocations due to market conditions, not permanent diversion of funds." "The pattern persisted for 3 years," I countered. "That's not temporary. It's systemic." I advanced to the next phase of my presentation, the transformation strategy itself. Now, regarding the concerns about our digital-first approach being radical or risky, let me present actual market data. For the next 20 minutes, I laid out the case for transformation with meticulous detail, industry trends, competitor analyses, customer preference shifts, and projected financial outcomes based on verifiable case studies. The contrast between my evidence-based approach and Thomas's emotional appeals couldn't have been more stark. The real risk, I concluded, isn't in embracing digital transformation. It's in continuing to resist it while our competitors capture the future of banking. The strategy I've proposed isn't radical, it's essential for Pinnacle's survival and growth. As I returned to my seat, the boardroom remained silent. Thomas stared at the emails still displayed on screen, the evidence of his manipulation impossible to dismiss. William Harper cleared his throat. In light of this information, I believe the board needs to discuss two separate issues. First, the transformation strategy itself, and second, the serious allegations of financial mismanagement that have been presented. He turned to Thomas and Greg. Given the nature of these allegations, I think it would be appropriate for you gentlemen to step out while the board deliberates. Thomas rose, his face flushed with barely contained fury. This is a coordinated attack on my reputation by someone with a personal vendetta. Rebecca and I have a history that's clearly influencing her judgment and interpretation of normal business decisions. It was exactly the personal attack I'd anticipated, his last desperate attempt to shift focus from his misconduct to our past relationship. Our personal history is indeed relevant, Mr. Anderson, I replied evenly, but not in the way you suggest. It taught me to recognize when someone is manipulating facts to serve their own interests rather than the greater good. A lesson that serves Pinnacle well today. As Thomas and Greg reluctantly left the room, William Harper addressed me. Ms. Anderson, given your role in bringing these allegations forward, would you be comfortable stepping out as well while we discuss this matter? Of course, I replied, gathering my materials. The evidence speaks for itself. I trust the board to make decisions in Pinnacle's best interest. I waited in my office during the board's deliberation, responding to emails and finalizing plans for the next phase of transformation. Regardless of the outcome, I had exposed the truth about Thomas's management. The board couldn't ignore such blatant evidence, even if some members had been aligned with him previously. Jennifer appeared in my doorway an hour later, her expression telling me everything I needed to know before she spoke. The board secretary just called. They're ready for you. I returned to the boardroom to find only the board members present. No sign of Thomas or Greg. William Harper's expression was solemn as he gestured for me to take a seat. Ms. Anderson, the board has reached several unanimous decisions after reviewing the evidence presented today. He glanced down at his notes. First, we fully endorse your transformation strategy for Pinnacle. The business case is compelling, and we believe it represents the best path forward for our shareholders, customers, and employees. A wave of satisfaction washed over me, though I maintained my professional composure. Thank you, Chairman Harper. The leadership team is prepared to begin implementation immediately. Second, he continued, in light of the audit findings and supporting evidence, the board has terminated Thomas Anderson and Gregory Phillips, effective immediately. The severity of the financial misrepresentations leaves us no alternative. The pronouncement fell like a gavel, final and irrevocable. Years of manipulation and self-serving decisions had finally caught up with Thomas, exposed under the unforgiving light of objective evidence. Additionally, William added, we've instructed legal counsel to conduct a full investigation into all financial decisions made over the past 5 years. If criminal misconduct is identified, appropriate authorities will be notified. I nodded, accepting the decision with appropriate gravity. A thorough investigation is certainly warranted. Pinnacle's shareholders deserve complete transparency. The board has also determined, William continued, looking directly at me, that while the personal history between you and Mr. Anderson is unfortunate, it does not constitute a conflict of interest that would impact your ability to lead Pinnacle's transformation. Your decisions have been substantiated by independent analysis and align with the company's best interests. Thank you for your confidence, I replied. I assure you that all my actions as majority shareholder have been and will continue to be guided by what's best for Pinnacle, its employees, and its customers. The meeting concluded with a discussion of next steps, an interim CFO appointment, communication strategy for the organizational changes, and implementation timeline for the transformation. Throughout these practical conversations, I felt a profound sense of closure that went beyond professional validation. After the board members departed, I took a moment alone in the empty boardroom. 5 years of rebuilding my life and career from the devastation Thomas had left behind had culminated in this moment of comprehensive vindication. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "Just heard the news. Thomas was escorted from the building. Security is sealing his office now. Congratulations, boss." I smiled, remembering Thomas's words the night after Olivia's graduation, when I'd confronted him about Jessica. "You'll never succeed without me. You're not cut out for this world." How wrong he had been. As I gathered my materials to leave, William Harper reappeared in the doorway. "Ms. Anderson, a word before you go?" I nodded, and he closed the door behind him. "That was quite a revelation," he said. "Though I suspect several board members already knew some version of your history with Thomas, I never intended to use it as leverage," I assured him. "The evidence spoke for itself." "Indeed it did," he agreed. "But I'm curious, was acquiring Pinnacle simply about revenge? About proving something to your ex-husband?" I considered his question carefully. When Eleanor Wright first approached me about the acquisition opportunity, I won't deny that the chance to demonstrate my capabilities to Thomas held a certain appeal, but that was never my primary motivation. "And what was?" William asked. "Pinnacle has incredible potential that's been systematically suppressed," I replied honestly. "The technology division alone could transform this company's future if properly supported. I acquired this company because I genuinely believe I can lead that transformation successfully." William studied me for a moment, then nodded with apparent satisfaction. "That's precisely what Eleanor said when she recommended you, that your personal history with Thomas might provide extra motivation, but your qualifications and vision were what Pinnacle truly needed." He extended his hand. "The board is fully behind you, Ms. Anderson. Make the most of this opportunity." As I shook his hand, I felt the weight of the past 5 years lifting. The ripples from today's events would continue spreading throughout Pinnacle and beyond, reshaping the company, redefining relationships, and opening possibilities that Thomas's leadership had deliberately constrained. But most importantly, they had finally washed away the last lingering doubts about my own capabilities, not in the board's eyes, but in my own. That evening, as promised, I took Olivia to dinner at Harbor View to celebrate her moot court selection. Watching her confidently discuss her legal arguments, I marveled at her resilience and determination. Unlike me, Olivia had never known a time when she doubted her capabilities. From her earliest years, I had deliberately nurtured her self-belief, determined that she would never internalize the limitations that Thomas had tried to impose on me. "So, it's official?" she asked, when there was a lull in our conversation about her law school experiences. "Dad's really been fired?" I nodded, taking a sip of wine. "The board terminated him this morning after reviewing evidence of financial misconduct." Olivia considered this, her expression thoughtful. "He called me again, said you orchestrated a witch hunt to get revenge for something that happened years ago." "And what did you say?" I asked, curious about her perspective. I told him that blaming others for the consequences of his own actions was exactly why he ended up in this situation. She gave me a small smile. I also suggested he use this as an opportunity for self-reflection, but I'm not holding my breath. I couldn't help but laugh at her insight. At 23, she understood her father's character better than I had after years of marriage. "I'm proud of you," I told her, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "Not just for your achievements, but for who you've become. Someone who sees people clearly and stands firmly in her own truth." "I had a good teacher," she replied, returning the squeeze. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. "Rebecca." Thomas's voice was slightly slurred, suggesting he'd been drinking. "I hope you're satisfied with yourself." I considered hanging up but decided to give him the closure this conversation might provide, for both of us. "This isn't about satisfaction, Thomas. It's about accountability." "Bullshit," he spat. "You've been planning this since the day I left. 5 years of plotting your revenge." "That's where you're wrong," I replied calmly. "For the first year after you left, I was focused solely on rebuilding my life and creating stability for Olivia. The next 4 years were about building my company and reputation based on real results. Pinnacle wasn't even on my radar until Eleanor approached me." "Eleanor?" he scoffed. "Another woman who couldn't handle being passed over for promotion." I sighed at his inability to see beyond his own narrow perspective. "Did it ever occur to you that the common denominator in all your professional and personal conflicts is your own behavior? That perhaps your problems stem not from vengeful women, but from your pattern of undermining others to elevate yourself?" There was a long silence on the line. When Thomas spoke again, his tone had shifted. "You really believe that, don't you? That this was all about justice rather than revenge?" "Justice and revenge aren't always mutually exclusive," I replied, thoughtfully. "But yes, I believe in the transformation strategy I've proposed for Pinnacle. I believe the company and its employees deserve leadership that prioritizes long-term growth over personal gain. The fact that implementing those beliefs required removing you from power is simply poetic." Another silence stretched between us. "You've changed," he finally said, his voice carrying a note of something almost like respect. "Yes," I agreed. "That's what growth looks like, Thomas. Something you might want to consider as you plan your next chapter." After we hung up, I stood by my bedroom window, looking out at the night sky. The conversation had been unexpectedly cathartic, not because I'd vanquished Thomas, but because I realized his opinion of me truly no longer mattered. The woman who had once desperately sought his approval and validation had evolved into someone who measured herself by her own standards of integrity and achievement. Monday morning brought a new energy to Pinnacle's headquarters. As I walked through the building, I could feel the shift, a lightness, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. Employees nodded respectfully, many stopping to express enthusiasm for the transformation strategy that had been announced company-wide that morning. The technology team had already begun work on the blockchain security protocol, energized by the resources and support they'd craved for years. The marketing department was developing a campaign to reposition Pinnacle as a digital innovation leader. Even the traditional banking team, after initial wariness, was finding opportunities within the new structure. In my office, where the traces of previous leadership had been replaced by my own vision, I reviewed the implementation timelines with Jennifer and Alex. The path ahead would be challenging, transformation always is, but for the first time, Pinnacle was aligned from the board down to pursue a clear, forward-looking strategy. "The industry analysts are already responding positively," Jennifer noted, showing me several financial news reports. 3 have upgraded our rating based on the leadership change and strategic pivot." I nodded, pleased but not surprised. The business case for our transformation had always been solid. It had simply been suppressed by Thomas's personal agenda and short-term focus. "What about Jessica?" I asked. "Has legal determined her status?" "They've granted her limited immunity in exchange for her continued cooperation with the investigation," Jennifer confirmed. "She's been reassigned to a legitimate role in compliance, where her knowledge of past practices might actually prove valuable." It was a fair resolution. Accountability balanced with opportunity for redemption. Unlike Thomas, Jessica had recognized her mistakes and taken steps to correct them, however self-interested her motivations might have been. As the day progressed, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The path from betrayed wife to corporate leader had been neither straight nor easy. But each challenge had added another layer of strength and wisdom to my character. Thomas had once told me I would never succeed without him. In the greatest irony of all, it was his abandonment that had forced me to discover capabilities I might never have recognized otherwise. His betrayal, meant to diminish me, had instead become the catalyst for my greatest growth. That evening, before leaving the office, I stood at the window Thomas had once claimed gave him the best view in the city. The skyline was beautiful, indeed. The setting sun, buildings glowing with golden light. But unlike Thomas, I didn't see it as a kingdom to be ruled. I saw a community of businesses and individuals, each pursuing their own version of success, each contributing to the greater whole. Pinnacle's transformation was just beginning, but already I could envision its completion. A financial institution that empowered customers through technology while maintaining the human connection essential to managing life's most important resources. It would take time, determination, and the collective effort of hundreds of talented people, but the foundation was now firmly in place. As I gathered my things to head home, my phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. Saw Pinnacle's stock jumped. Percent today. Congratulations, Mom. You were right all along. I smiled at her message, typing back, "About what specifically?" Her response came quickly. That the best revenge isn't about destroying what hurt you. It's about building something better in its place. My daughter had always been wise beyond her years. In those few words, she had captured the essence of what I'd learned through this entire journey. True empowerment comes not from defeating one's opponents, but from transcending the need to define oneself in opposition to them. Thomas would face the consequences of his actions, both professionally and personally. But my own journey had evolved beyond the need to witness or orchestrate his downfall. The woman who had once felt devastated by his betrayal had become someone whose identity and worth existed completely independent of his recognition or approval. And that, I realized as I headed home under the darkening sky, was the most profound victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.